Hey guys, so we'll be looking at event listeners in JavaScript. An event, in the simplest of terms, is an action that is carried out in the HTML part of your file. Here, things like submitting a form or clicking on a button or even editing the screen size of your device. That's the width of your designing device. So we have three basic events in JavaScript. The first is the click event. Then we have the submit event, as well as the resize event. We'll start by looking at the click event. So what I'm going to do first off is, in my HTML file here, I'm going to create a button element that holds a text that says click. And I'm going to select this element in my JavaScript. So I would give it a class, give it the name of my_btn. Once I do that, back in my JavaScript, I would create a variable called btn for the button I'm about to select and use my query selector to handle that. So select the class of my_btn. So that's the button. Now what I want to do is, if I check my HTML file here, I have the button here. So the essence of this is, every time I click on the button, I want to see a text appear on my console. Now that's where event listeners come in. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to add an event listener to this btn element here. And this is how we do it. btn.add_event_listener, which is a function. Now the event listener function accepts two values. The first is, what type of event are we listening out for? And I'm listening for the click event. Meaning, whenever this event is triggered, I can now specify the code to run. After I do that, I will then pass in a callback function. Written in this callback function is the code to run whenever the specified event, in this case click, is triggered. So I would just send to my console a text that says button clicked. So when I click on the button now, on my console I see button clicked. I click on it again, I see second button clicked. So every time I click on this button, I am running the code inside my callback function. And that's the click event. The other event we'd look at is the submit event. Now the submit event is concerned with forms in HTML, where when there is a form to fill and the users fill the form and they submit it, then we could specify what would happen, just like we did in the click event. So I'm going to pass in a form element here, and I'll just pass in an input field, give it a placeholder, asking for a user's name. After which I would pass a button element that says submit. Now, since I know my button is inside the form element, I'm going to give it a type set to submit. So I want to select my form now in JavaScript. So I'll give it a class of my_form, the same syntax. Okay? Yes. And select it in JavaScript. So every time you want to select an element this way, it's always advisable to do it at the top of your screen. So const of form is going to be equal to document, and as usual I would use the query selector pointing to a class of my_form. Now the submit event follows a very similar syntax to that of the click event, in that you call the element your event listener function and specify that you are listening for the submit event, then your regular callback function. So all I want to do every time this form is submitted is send to the console a text that says form submitted. So when I check out my browser and I pass in a name here, John, and I click submit, for a very short period of time there, I see a text form submitted. Now why it appears as though that text is not being displayed properly is, every event in JavaScript has a default action. And the default action of the submit event in JavaScript is to reload my page every time a form is submitted. So what I'm going to do is, I have to now stop that default action. So as a parameter to the callback function, I'll pass in event. So the first thing I do, even before I send any text to my console, is event.prevent_default as a function. So this .prevent_default now stops the default action of any event. So if I now actually pass in my name of John and click submit, I then see that form submitted remains on my console. I click submit again, I see another form submitted. Okay. Then the last event we'll be looking at is the resize event. Now the resize event is triggered every time we change or alter the width of our designing device. So since we are bothered about the width here, every time we want to use the resize event, we point to Windows this time around and no longer an element. So this is what I would do. Window dot add event listener, because I'm trying to listen on the entire window. And then I would listen for the resize event. Then the same syntax, my callback function, where I want to send to the console a text that says screen resized. So when I come here and I take away the console now, so I'm going to inspect my page afresh. And I go to my console. You realize every time I resize my screen, I get screen resized appear on the console. So that's about the resize event. So it's triggered whenever the size of your screen changes. And we're using window this time around, no longer a regular element, because we're trying to point to the entire window here, not just an element. So that is event listeners in JavaScript.